Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today we have a story that's going to stick with you for a while. It's a story about a man, a crime, and a discovery that will leave you absolutely speechless. It's a story that highlights some of the harsh realities of life, the vulnerabilities we all face, and the unexpected places where you can find both heartbreak and hope. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a human story, a story about community, and a story that asks the question, what happens when the people we rely on for protection are facing their own battles? Our story begins with a 911 call. The voice on the other end of the line is that of an elderly black man, Mr. Thomas. He's a veteran, a man who served his country, a man who deserves to live his golden years in peace and security. But on this particular night, his peace is shattered. He calls 911, his voice trembling slightly, reporting a burglary. Someone has broken into his home, the place where he should feel safest. The dispatcher, a calm and professional voice in the midst of the rising tension, assures him that help is on the way. A patrol officer, Officer Davis, is dispatched to the scene. It seems like a routine call, a simple break-in. Sadly, these kinds of calls are all too common. But what Officer Davis discovers when he arrives at Mr. Thomas's home is anything but routine. It's something far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Thomas lives in a modest, well-kept house in a quiet neighborhood. It's the kind of neighborhood where people know each other, where kids play in the streets, and where a sense of community still exists. Or at least it used to. Lately, things have been changing. A sense of unease has crept in, a feeling that something isn't quite right. And for Mr. Thomas, that feeling becomes a terrifying reality when he hears the sound of his back door being forced open. He's no longer the young soldier he once was. Age has taken its toll, but his spirit remains strong. He grabs the only weapon he can find, a heavy old flashlight, and cautiously makes his way through his darkened house. He's scared, but he's also determined. He won't be a victim. When Officer Davis arrives, he finds Mr. Thomas shaken, but unharmed. The house, however, is a mess. Drawers have been pulled open, furniture overturned. It's clear that the intruder was looking for something. But what? Mr. Thomas tells Officer Davis that he doesn't think anything of significant value has been taken. A few trinkets, maybe some loose change. It seems strange. Why would someone break into a house and take so little? It's a question that Officer Davis can't quite shake. Something about the situation feels off. It's not just the petty theft. It's the feeling he gets when he looks at Mr. Thomas. There's a deeper sadness in the old man's eyes, a weariness that goes beyond the shock of the break-in. Officer Davis begins his investigation. He dusts for fingerprints, takes photos of the damage, and talks to Mr. Thomas, trying to piece together what happened. As he talks to Mr. Thomas, he learns more about the old veteran's life. He learns about his service, his late wife, and his struggles to make ends meet on a fixed income. He learns about the loneliness that Mr. Thomas feels, the isolation that comes with growing old and losing loved ones. And he learns about the fear that has been growing in the neighborhood, the fear that something bad is about to happen. As Officer Davis delves deeper into the investigation, he starts to uncover a series of unsettling clues. Small things, seemingly insignificant on their own, begin to paint a much larger, much darker picture. He discovers that Mr. Thomas isn't the only one who has experienced recent troubles. Other homes in the neighborhood have also been targeted. Not just burglaries, but also acts of vandalism, even some minor assaults. It's like the neighborhood is slowly unraveling, losing its sense of security, its sense of community. But the most disturbing clue comes from Mr. Thomas himself. He mentions something that he initially dismissed as unimportant, something he almost forgot to tell Officer Davis. He talks about a strange car he's seen parked near his house in the past few weeks, a black sedan with tinted windows. He didn't pay much attention to it at the time, but now he wonders if it could be connected to the break-in. Officer Davis asks him if he noticed anything else about the car, anything that could help identify it. Mr. Thomas struggles to remember, his memory not as sharp as it once was. But then, he remembers something. A sticker on the back window of the car. A sticker that he can't quite describe, but a sticker that he knows he's seen before. He put the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. He turned to walk away, but then he stopped. He looked at the box again, a sudden thought striking him. He picked up the box and opened it. He rummaged through the contents until he found what he was looking for. It was a small, worn leather pouch. He opened the pouch and poured the contents into his hand. They were medals, his medals from the war. He had kept them hidden for years, tucked away in the back of the box. He hadn't thought about them in a long time. He looked at the medals, each one representing a sacrifice, a battle fought, a life lived. He remembered the stories behind each medal, the bravery of his fellow soldiers, the horrors of war. He had earned these medals. He had risked his life for his country. And now they were gone. Or were they? He remembered the intruder, the way he had ransacked the house. He hadn't found the medals. They were still hidden in the box, under the photograph. But why would someone break into his house and not take anything of value? It didn't make sense. Unless they weren't looking for valuables. Unless they were looking for something else. Something specific. Something that he had hidden away. Something that he hadn't thought about in years. Something that could be worth more than money. Something that could be dangerous. He thought about the word redemption again. He thought about the gang, their reputation for violence, their control over the streets. He thought about the black sedan, the tinted windows, the sticker on the back. He thought about the intruder, the way he had moved through the house as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. And then it hit him. He knew what they were looking for. He knew why they had targeted his house. It wasn't just a random break-in. It was a targeted attack. They were after something that he had, something that they wanted. And he knew that if they got it, he would be in grave danger. But what was it? What could be so valuable, so dangerous, that a gang like Redemption would risk everything to get it? Mr. Thomas looked at the medals in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he had to protect whatever it was. He had to keep it out of their hands. But how? He was just an old man, alone and vulnerable. How could he possibly fight against a gang like Redemption? Mr. Thomas's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. What could Redemption possibly want from him? He hadn't been involved in anything illegal, hadn't crossed anyone that he knew of. His life was quiet, simple. Or so he thought. He looked at the medals again, their cold metal reflecting the dim light of his living room. Could it be something to do with his past? His service? He hadn't talked about his time in the war for decades, hadn't even thought about it much. It was a chapter of his life he had closed, a chapter filled with both pride and pain. He remembered a specific mission, a dangerous operation behind enemy lines, a mission that went wrong, a mission where lives were lost. He had been the one to carry the message, the crucial information that could have saved them. But he had been ambushed, captured, and tortured. He had managed to escape, but the information had been lost, or so he believed. Could it be that Redemption was after that information? Information that was still relevant after all these years? It seemed impossible, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected. He had kept the details of that mission locked away in his memory, a secret he had carried for decades. But maybe, just maybe, someone else knew about it. Maybe someone had been looking for him, waiting for him to resurface. He thought about the black sedan again, the word redemption on the back window. He thought about the intruder, the way he had moved through the house with such purpose. It wasn't just a random burglary. It was a search for something specific. And Mr. Thomas was starting to believe that he knew what it was. Meanwhile, Officer Davis and his team were working tirelessly at the precinct. They had pulled up everything they could find on Redemption, their known members, their aliases, their past crimes. They were a well-organized gang, with connections to other criminal organizations both locally and nationally. They were involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and even human trafficking. They were ruthless, violent, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Officer Davis felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that Mr. Thomas was in danger. He had to find a way to protect him, to keep him safe from Redemption's reach. He also knew that he had to find out what Redemption was after. What was so important that they would risk everything to get it. He went back to Mr. Thomas's house, hoping to get more information. He found Mr. Thomas sitting in his living room, looking worried and distracted. Officer Davis told him about Redemption, their reputation, their reach. He asked Mr. Thomas if he had any idea why they would target him. Mr. Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to involve Officer Davis in his past, in the secrets he had kept buried for so long. But he knew that he had no choice. He had to trust someone, and Officer Davis seemed like the only person he could turn to. He told Officer Davis about his time in the war, about the mission that went wrong, about the information that was lost. He told him about the fear that had haunted him for years. The fear that someone would come looking for him, looking for that information. Officer Davis listened intently, his face growing more serious with each word. He realized that this was much bigger than he had initially thought. This wasn't just a local gang. This was something that went back decades, something that involved national security. He asked Mr. Thomas if he had any idea what the information was, what it could be used for. Mr. Thomas shook his head. He had never known the specifics, only that it was crucial to the success of the mission. He had been entrusted with it, but he had failed to deliver it. And now, it seemed, that failure was coming back to haunt him. Officer Davis knew that he had to find that information. It was the key to protecting Mr. Thomas, the key to stopping Redemption, but where to start? The mission had taken place decades ago. The records were probably buried deep within government archives. He left Mr. Thomas's house, his mind filled with questions. He knew that he was facing a race against time. Redemption was closing in, and he had to find the information before they did. He had to protect Mr. Thomas, he had to stop Redemption, and he had to uncover the secrets of the past before they were used to create chaos in the present. He returned to the precinct, determined to find answers. He gathered his team, told them everything Mr. Thomas had told him. They began to dig through old military records, searching for any mention of the mission, any clue that could lead them to the information. They worked through the night, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, their determination growing with each passing hour. They knew that lives were at stake, that the fate of the community rested on their shoulders. They were the last line of defense against Redemption, the only hope for Mr. Thomas. But time was running out. Redemption was getting closer, and the clock was ticking. As Officer Davis and his team frantically searched through decades-old military archives, Mr. Thomas sat in his darkened living room, a sense of dread washing over him. He knew that Redemption was coming for him. He could feel it in his bones. He thought about the information, the secret he had carried for so long. It wasn't just a piece of paper, a set of coordinates, or a list of names. It was something more, something that could ignite a firestorm. It was a truth that someone wanted to keep buried, a truth that could expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to protect the information, even if it meant risking his own life. He thought about where he could go, where he could hide. But he knew that Redemption's reach was long. They had eyes everywhere, informants in every corner of the city. There was nowhere he could go that they wouldn't find him. He looked around, his living room, his gaze settling on the old wooden box on the mantelpiece. He walked over to it, opened the lid, and took out the leather pouch containing his medals. He clutched them tightly in his hand, feeling the weight of them, the weight of his past. He knew what he had to do. He had to face his past, confront the demons that had haunted him for so long. He had to protect the truth no matter the cost. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Davis and his team had finally found a lead. They had discovered a classified report about the mission Mr. Thomas had been involved in, a mission codenamed Operation Nightfall. The report was heavily redacted, but they were able to piece together some of the details. It was a covert operation, a mission to infiltrate a heavily guarded enemy stronghold and retrieve vital intelligence. The intelligence, according to the report, was a list of double agents operating within the highest levels of the U.S. government. Officer Davis felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about a local gang. It was about national security. If Redemption got their hands on that list, they could compromise the entire intelligence network, putting the country at risk. He knew that he had to find Mr. Thomas, warn him about the danger, and get the information before Redemption did. Officer Davis feels a chill run down his spine. He knows that this sticker could be the key to unlocking the mystery. He asks Mr. Thomas to try his best to remember the details of the sticker, anything at all. Mr. Thomas closes his eyes, straining. His memory. He sees the black sedan, the tinted windows, and then the sticker. He remembers the shape, the color, and a single word that was written on it. He tells Officer Davis the word. It's a word that sends a shockwave through the officer. It's a word that connects the break-in to something much bigger, something much more sinister than a simple burglary. It's a word that suggests a level of danger that Mr. Thomas could never have imagined, and that's where we're going to leave it for today. What was the word? What did Officer Davis discover? And what does it all mean for Mr. Thomas and the rest of the neighborhood? Join us in the next part of this story as we unravel the mystery and uncover the shocking truth behind the break-in. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next installment. This is a story you won't want to miss. The word Mr. Thomas uttered was redemption. Officer Davis felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Redemption. It wasn't just a word. It was a name. The name of a local gang. A gang known for its ruthless tactics and its grip on the surrounding neighborhoods. They weren't just petty criminals. They were involved in everything from drug trafficking to extortion. Their presence had been growing in the area, and Officer Davis had been worried about their influence. He had heard whispers, rumors of their recruitment tactics, their intimidation methods. But he had never had any concrete evidence, anything he could use to take action. Until now. The word redemption on the back of that black sedan connected the break-in at Mr. Thomas's house to something much larger, something much more dangerous. It wasn't just a simple burglary, it was a message. A message that Redemption was expanding its territory, a message that no one was safe. Officer Davis knew that he had to act quickly. He had to protect Mr. Thomas, and he had to find a way to stop Redemption before they took over the entire neighborhood. He thanked Mr. Thomas for his help and assured him that he would do everything in his power to bring the perpetrators to justice. He left Mr. Thomas's house, his mind racing, trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He knew that he couldn't handle this alone. He needed backup, he needed resources, and he needed a plan. He drove back to the precinct, the image of the black sedan and the word redemption burned into his memory. He walked into the station, the familiar hum of police radios and ringing phones, a stark contrast to the quiet tension he felt inside. He went straight to his captain's office, knocked on the door, and entered. Captain Miller looked up from his paperwork, a weary expression on his face. He had seen too much in his years on the force, too much violence, too much despair. He listened as Officer Davis recounted the events of the night, the break-in at Mr. Thomas's house, the strange car, and the word redemption. Captain Miller's face grew serious. He knew about redemption. He had heard the same whispers, the same rumors. He had been waiting for something like this, a concrete link between the gang and the local crimes. He knew that this was their chance to take them down, but he also knew that it wouldn't be easy. Redemption was powerful, well-connected, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. He told Officer Davis to gather all the information he could find on Redemption, their members, their activities, their connections. He also assigned several other officers to the case, forming a task force dedicated to bringing down the gang. They knew that they were facing a formidable enemy, but they were determined to protect their community. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas was trying to make sense of what had happened. He sat in his living room, the overturned furniture a constant reminder of the intrusion. He thought about the word redemption, the word that had sent a chill down his spine. He had heard whispers of the gang, their reputation for violence, their control over the streets. He wondered why they would target his house. He didn't have anything of value, nothing that they could possibly want, or so he thought. He got up and walked over to a small wooden box on his mantelpiece. He opened the box and took out an old photograph. It was a picture of him and his wife, taken many years ago, when they were young and full of life. He smiled, sadly, remembering the happy times they had shared. He traced his fingers over her face, his heart aching with the loss. He tried to call Mr. Thomas, but there was no answer. He raced back to his house, his heart pounding in his chest. He arrived to find the front door kicked in, the house ransacked. Mr. Thomas was gone. Officer Davis felt a wave of panic wash over him. He knew that redemption had taken him. He knew that they were after the list. He had to find them. He had to save Mr. Thomas. He had to stop redemption before it was too late. He gathered his team, told them about Operation Nightfall, about the list of double agents. They knew that they were facing a formidable enemy, an enemy with deep connections and unlimited resources, but they were determined to fight, to protect their country, to bring redemption to justice. They tracked Mr. Thomas's cell phone signal, following it to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They surrounded the warehouse, weapons drawn, ready for a confrontation. Officer Davis knew that this was it, the moment of truth. He was about to face redemption, the gang that had terrorized his community, the gang that threatened to destroy everything he believed in. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. He knew that lives were on the line, that the fate of the nation rested on his shoulders. He was ready to fight. Inside the warehouse, Mr. Thomas was tied to a chair, surrounded by redemption gang members. Their leader, a ruthless man known as Razor, stood before him, his eyes filled with malice. He demanded the list, threatening to kill Mr. Thomas if he didn't cooperate. Mr. Thomas refused. He knew that the list was too dangerous, that it could fall into the wrong hands. He wouldn't let that happen, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. Razor laughed, a cold, chilling sound. He told Mr. Thomas that he had no choice. He had men watching his house, watching his every move. They knew about the list. They knew where it was hidden. All he had to do was tell them where it was, and they would let him go. Mr. Thomas remained silent, his gaze fixed on Razor, his eyes filled with defiance. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He would take the secret to his grave. Razor's face twisted with anger. He raised his hand, signaling to his men. They grabbed Mr. Thomas, dragging him towards a dark corner of the warehouse. Mr. Thomas knew what was about to happen. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the pain. Suddenly, the warehouse doors burst open. Officer Davis and his team stormed in, guns blazing. A fierce firefight erupted, the sounds of gunfire echoing through the warehouse. Mr. Thomas watched in horror as the battle raged around him, fearing for his life, fearing for the safety of the officers. The warehouse was a chaotic scene. Gunfire echoed off the corrugated iron walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Officer Davis and his team fought their way through the redemption gang members, determined to reach Mr. Thomas. Razor, seeing his plans disrupted, barked orders at his men, a snarl twisting his face. He knew the list was close, within his grasp, and he wouldn't let these cops take it from him. Mr. Thomas, still tied to the chair, watched the firefight unfold with a mix of fear and hope. He knew that his life hung in the balance, but he also knew that these officers were his only chance of survival. He prayed that they would reach him in time. Officer Davis finally broke through the line of gang members and saw Mr. Thomas tied to the chair. He rushed towards him, but Razor stepped in his way, a glint of madness in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere, officer," he snarled, raising his weapon. A tense standoff ensued, the two men facing each other, the fate of Mr. Thomas and the list hanging in the balance. Officer Davis knew that he had to act quickly. He couldn't risk Mr. Thomas's life, and he couldn't let Razor escape with the list. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the warehouse. "Hold it right there!" Everyone froze. Officer Davis turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in a sharp suit, her face hidden in the dim light. She held a briefcase in her hand. Razor looked at the woman, a puzzled expression on his face. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman stepped forward, revealing her face. It was Agent Miller, a high-ranking official from a government agency, an agency officer Davis had only heard whispers about. Her presence here was a shock, a complete surprise. "I'm here to collect what belongs to the United States government," Agent Miller said, her voice cold and authoritative. She opened the briefcase, revealing a small metallic device. "This," she said, "is the decryption key for the list, and I'm taking it with me." Officer Davis was stunned. He had never expected this. He had thought that redemption was the biggest threat, but now it seemed that there was another player in this game, a player even more powerful, even more dangerous. Razor, realizing that he was being outmaneuvered, lunged at Agent Miller, trying to grab the briefcase. But before he could reach her, several men in black suits appeared out of nowhere, surrounding Agent Miller, their weapons drawn. They were government agents, and they were here to protect her. A second firefight erupted, this time between Redemption and the government agents. Officer Davis and his team found themselves caught in the crossfire, unsure of who to trust, unsure of who the real enemy was. Mr. Thomas, still tied to the chair, watched the chaos unfold, his mind reeling. He had thought that he was protecting the list from Redemption, but now it seemed that there were others who wanted it, others who were willing to kill for it. He realized that he was caught in a web of intrigue, a conspiracy that went far beyond anything he could have imagined. As the battle raged around him, Mr. Thomas noticed something that no one else seemed to see. One of the government agents, a young man with a nervous expression, was subtly moving away from the others, heading towards a side exit. He had the briefcase with the decryption key. Mr. Thomas's eyes widened. He recognized the young agent. He had seen him before, not at the warehouse, but somewhere else. He strained his memory, trying to place him. And then, it hit him. He had seen him at Redemption's headquarters talking to Razor. Mr. Thomas realized with a jolt that the young agent wasn't who he seemed to be. He wasn't there to protect the decryption key. He was there to steal it. He was a double agent, working for Redemption, or perhaps for someone even more powerful. He tried to warn Officer Davis, but the gunfire was too loud, his voice drowned out by the chaos. He knew that he had to do something. He had to stop the young agent before it was too late. But what could he do? He was tied to a chair, helpless, at the mercy of the warring factions. The young agent reached the side exit, the briefcase in his hand. He looked around, making sure no one was watching, and then slipped out into the night. Mr. Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had failed. He had tried to protect the list, but it was now in the hands of the enemy. He had trusted the wrong people, and now the consequences could be catastrophic. The darkness hung heavy in the warehouse, the echoes of the previous firefight slowly fading. Officer Davis, disoriented but alive, stumbled through the debris, searching for Mr. Thomas. He found him still tied to the chair, shaken, but unharmed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Mr. Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "The agent, he got away," he whispered. "He has the briefcase." Officer Davis's heart sank. He knew what that meant. The decryption key was in the hands of the enemy. All their efforts, all the sacrifices, had been for nothing. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had failed. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the shadows. "Not so fast, officer." It was Agent Miller. She stepped forward, the briefcase still in her hand. "The agent may have left with a briefcase," she said, "but he didn't get the key." Officer Davis looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about, Agent?" Miller smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. "The briefcase he took was empty," she said. "The real decryption key is right here." She held up a small, unassuming USB drive. Officer Davis was stunned. He couldn't believe it. Agent Miller had outsmarted them all. She had anticipated the agent's betrayal and had taken precautions. She had protected the key. But how? He had seen the agent take the briefcase. He had seen him escape. How could she have switched it? Agent Miller explained. She had known about the double agent for some time. She had been playing a dangerous game, using him to flush out other members of the conspiracy. She had allowed him to take the empty briefcase, knowing that he would lead her to them. She had followed him to a secluded location, a safe house where Redemption's leaders were waiting for the decryption key. She had watched them, listened to their plans. She now had all the evidence she needed to expose them, to bring them down. But why? Officer Davis asked. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us believe that the key was lost? Agent Miller sighed. Because I needed to see who was involved, she said. I needed to know the full extent of the conspiracy. It goes much deeper than Redemption, officer. It reaches into the highest levels of government, people you would never suspect. Officer Davis felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that this was much bigger than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about a gang. It was about corruption, about betrayal, about the very fabric of their society. He looked at Mr. Thomas, who was watching them with a mixture of awe and understanding. He realized that Mr. Thomas had known all along. He had known about the conspiracy. He had known about the danger. He had been protecting the secret, not just from Redemption, but from everyone. But what about the list? Officer Davis asked. What about the double agents? Agent Miller nodded. The list is safe, she said. It's encrypted, and only I have the means to decrypt it. I will make sure it's handled properly, that the traitors are brought to justice. She looked at Mr. Thomas, her eyes filled with respect. You've done your country a great service, she said. You've protected the truth, even at great personal risk. Mr. Thomas smiled, a weary but proud smile. I did what I had to do, he said. It was my duty. The scene shifts to a few days later. Redemption's leaders have been arrested, their organization dismantled. The double agents have been exposed, their treachery brought to light. The conspiracy has been uncovered, its roots reaching into the darkest corners of power. Mr. Thomas is back in his house, the overturned furniture replaced, the sense of peace restored. He sits in his living room, looking at the photograph of his wife, a sense of closure washing over him. He knows that he has done the right thing, that he has protected the truth. Officer Davis visits him, bringing him a small gift, a framed certificate of appreciation from the government. Thank you, Mr. Thomas says, accepting the gift. Thank you for everything. You're the real hero, Officer Davis says. You risked your life to protect your country. Mr. Thomas shakes his head. I just did what any good soldier would do, he says. But there's one final twist. As Officer Davis is about to leave, Mr. Thomas stops him. There's one more thing, he says. About the mission, Operation Nightfall. There was something else, something I never told anyone. Officer Davis turns back, intrigued. What is it? Mr. Thomas hesitates, then takes a deep breath. The list wasn't the only thing we were after, he says. There was something else, something even more dangerous. A weapon of mass destruction. Officer Davis's eyes widen. A weapon? Mr. Thomas nods. It was a biological weapon, he says. A virus engineered to target specific ethnic groups. Officer Davis is stunned. He can't believe what he's hearing. And where is it? He asks. Mr. Thomas looks at him, his eyes filled with a chilling realization. That's what I don't know, he says. That's what I was really protecting. Not just the list, but the secret of that weapon. And now, it's out there somewhere, waiting. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. A biological weapon, a virus designed for targeted destruction. It was a chilling thought, a terrifying possibility. Officer Davis stared at Mr. Thomas, his mind reeling. He had thought the conspiracy was over, that the danger had been averted. But it seemed that the real threat was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Why didn't you tell me before? Officer Davis asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thomas sighed. Because I didn't know who to trust, he said. I knew that some people would stop at nothing to get their hands on that weapon. I had to protect it, even if it meant keeping the secret hidden. But who knows about it? Officer Davis asked. Who else knows about the virus? Mr. Thomas shook his head. I don't know, he said. That's the problem. I only know what I was told, what I overheard. The details of the weapon, its location, its capabilities. That was all kept secret from me." Officer Davis felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had thought he had closed one chapter, but it seemed he had just opened another, even more dangerous one. He knew that he had to find the weapon. He had to stop it from falling into the wrong hands. The fate of countless lives could depend on it. "What do we do now?" he asked. Mr. Thomas looked at him, his eyes filled with a weary determination. "We do what we always do," he said. "We fight. We protect. We never give up." And so, the search began. Officer Davis and his team, along with Agent Miller and her agency, launched a massive investigation, trying to track down any information about the biological weapon. They scoured old military records, interviewed former intelligence agents, followed every lead, no matter how small. The trail led them down a rabbit hole of secret organizations, hidden agendas, and powerful individuals who were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. They discovered that the weapon had been developed decades ago, during the Cold War, as part of a top-secret program. The goal was to create a weapon that could be used to target specific populations, a weapon that could win a war without firing a single shot. But the program had been shut down, the weapon supposedly destroyed. Or so they thought. It seemed that some individuals within the government had kept the weapon hidden, believing that it could be used as a tool of power, a means of control. As Officer Davis and his team delved deeper into the investigation, they uncovered a network of conspirators, individuals in positions of power who were working to unleash the virus, to use it to achieve their own twisted goals. They were facing a powerful enemy, an enemy that was willing to use a biological weapon to achieve their aims. The stakes were higher than ever before. It wasn't just about stopping a gang or uncovering a conspiracy. It was about preventing a global catastrophe. It was about saving humanity. The investigation led them across the globe, from secret labs in remote locations to hidden bunkers deep underground. They followed the trail of the virus, tracking its movements, trying to anticipate its next destination. They discovered that the conspirators were planning to release the virus at a major international summit, hoping to unleash it on world leaders, causing chaos and panic. They knew that they had to stop them. They had to prevent the attack. The climax arrived at the international summit. Officer Davis and his team, along with Agent Miller and her agents, infiltrated the summit, searching for the conspirators, searching for the virus. They knew that time was running out. The attack could happen at any moment. They found the conspirators in a hidden room preparing to release the virus. A fierce battle ensued, the fate of the world hanging in the balance. Officer Davis and his team fought bravely, risking their lives to stop the conspirators. In the end, they were successful. They captured the conspirators, seized the virus, and prevented the attack. The world was safe. The story concludes with a sense of resolution, but also with a sense of caution. The biological weapon has been secured, the conspirators brought to justice, but the threat remains. The knowledge of the virus, the technology to create it, is still out there. It is a reminder that the world is a dangerous place, that there are those who are willing to use any means to achieve their goals. Mr. Thomas, now hailed as a hero, reflects on the events that have transpired. He is grateful that the world has been saved, but he knows that the fight is not over. There will always be those who seek power, those who are willing to use violence and terror to achieve their aims. The only way to combat them is to remain vigilant, to stand up for what is right, to never give up. Officer Davis, Agent Miller, and their teams continue to work to protect the world from future threats, knowing that their work is never done. They have seen the darkness that lurks in the shadows, and they are determined to keep it at bay. The story of Mr. Thomas, the elderly veteran who became an unlikely hero, serves as a reminder that anyone can make a difference, that even the smallest person can have a profound impact on the world. It is a story of courage, of sacrifice, of the enduring power of the human spirit. It is a story that reminds us that we must always be vigilant, that we must always be ready to fight for what is right, that we must never give up hope. And so, the story ends, but the message remains. The world is a complex and dangerous place, but it is also a place of hope, a place where good can triumph over evil. It is a place where ordinary people can rise to extraordinary challenges, where heroes can emerge from the most unexpected places. It is a place where the fight for justice continues, where the search for truth never ends. And it is a place where the human spirit, resilient and unwavering, will always find a way to prevail.